A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't sayin' nothin'. Just don't send me back. The biting wind tore through the barren plain, a dry and merciless thing that scoured life from the dust. It whipped around the solitary cabin on Silas Blackwood's homestead, rattling the single wooden door in its frame and moaning through the cracks in the mud chinking. Inside, Silas moved with a deliberate quiet that had long ago replaced speech. His world was one of routine, of chopping wood until his shoulders ached with a familiar, weary burn, of mending fences that guarded nothing but empty land, and of staring into the dusty sun as it bled across the slate evening sky. He was a man hollowed out by loss, his silence a monument to a wife and child who now lay under two small mounds of rock on the rise behind his home. Their ghosts were his only company, and he had learned to live with them, to endure their unseen presence in the creak of floorboards and the sigh of the wind. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him, waiting in the crucible of another's suffering. His trip into the ramshackle settlement of redemption was a necessity, not a choice. He needed salt and flour, things he could not pull from the ungenerous earth. The town was little more than a collection of weary, clapboard buildings huddled together against the vastness, a place where hope came to die. Today, a raw energy crackled in the frosty air. A crowd had gathered near the livery, their faces a mixture of cruel curiosity and grim satisfaction. At the center of it, a man broad-shouldered and weathered, with a mean glint in his eye, stood beside a cage on a wagon. This was Jedediah Kane, a man who called himself a blood hunter, though he trafficked in the living, not the dead. Inside the cage, bound in heavy chains that clinked with every shiver, sat a woman. She was worn down, her dress little more than rags, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion. A small boy, no older than 4, clung to her, his face buried in her lap. The woman's gaze was fixed on nothing, her body rigid with a concealed terror. She was not shattered, but exhausted, a resilient survivor pushed to the very edge of her endurance. The townsfolk murmured, their words like stones. Kane was auctioning them. He spoke of debts and contracts, of a husband who had run out on his obligations, leaving his family as collateral. Silas watched, his hands clenched into fists in his coat pockets. The sight of the child, small and vulnerable, struck a raw, suppressed nerve deep inside him. It was a wound he thought had long since scarred over, but the pain was as fresh as a new grave. He saw his own son's face in the boy's dark hair, his own wife's quiet dignity in the woman's unyielding posture. The cold in his gut had nothing to do with the wind. He felt the familiar numbness creeping in, the urge to turn away, to retreat back to the silent safety of his homestead and the company of his ghosts. He had nothing to offer, no words of comfort, no place in his life for the living. But he couldn't move. He just stood there, a statue of regret, as the bidding began. Silas did not know what moved him. It was an impulse born of a guilt so deep it had become a part of his bones. He heard the paltry offers, the leering suggestions from the crowd, and something inside him snapped. It was not a conscious decision, but an eruption of feeling from a man who had sworn off emotion entirely. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over the dusty ground. The crowd parted for him, unnerved by the intensity in his tired eyes that had seen everything and found it wanting. He didn't look at Jedediah Kane. He looked at the woman. He saw the flicker of fear in her gaze, the way she instinctively pulled the child closer. He was just another threat in a world made of them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch that held the coin from his last sale of pelts. It was everything he had, meant to last him through the winter. Without a word, he threw it at Kane's feet. The pouch landed in the dust with a heavy thud. A gasp went through the crowd. Kane, surprised, crouched and picked it up, weighing it in his massive hand. He looked from the coin to Silas's weathered face, a slow, greedy smile spreading across his lips. "For the woman and the boy," Silas said. His voice was rough from disuse, like cracking ice. "There with me." The words hung in the frosty air, stark and final. Kane's smile widened. He had expected to get a fraction of this. He unlocked the cage with a flourish, the metal clinking on tin. "They're all yours, friend." The chains were struck from the woman's wrists, leaving raw, red marks. She stumbled out of the cage, unsteady on her feet, still clutching the boy. She did not look at Silas. Her gaze was on the ground, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She was free from the cage but bound by a new, uncertain debt. He remained silent. Then, "If you want to stay—" He didn't finish the sentence. He just turned and walked toward his wagon, the creak of the wheels a lonely sound in the sudden hush. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she had no other choice. He felt her presence behind him, 2 sets of footsteps in the dust, one large, one small. A memory flickered. Another woman, another child, walking beside him under a kinder sun. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces. He had not saved them. He had only bought them. He had exchanged one cage for another. The thought settled in his stomach, as cold and heavy as a stone. The journey to the homestead was a study in silence. Alara, she had not offered her name, but he had heard Cain use it, sat in the back of the wagon with her son, Leo. She held the boy tight, a human shield against the biting wind and the silent man driving them toward an unknown fate. She flinched every time the wagon jolted, her body a taut line of suspicion. She had been passed from one owner to another, and this one's quiet was more unnerving than Cain's open cruelty. Silas did not speak. He kept his eyes on the weary trail, his shoulders a rigid wall between them and the world. He was acutely aware of them, of the soft sounds of the boy's breathing, of the woman's suppressed shivers. The homestead, when they arrived, was no comfort. It was a stark silhouette against the slate evening sky, a place of profound isolation. The cabin was small, just one room with a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a single cot. Place for one person. He gestured toward the inside with a nod. Food on the shelf. Water in the bucket. He unhitched the horse and led it to the lean-to, leaving them alone in the growing dusk. Alara entered the cabin cautiously, her eyes darting around the spare interior. It was clean but empty of warmth, the home of a man who did not truly live in it. She saw the cot and swallowed hard. Fear, bitter and familiar, coiled in her belly. She would not be used. She would endure for Leo. She found a pile of blankets in a wooden chest and made a bed for them on the floor by the cold hearth, as far from the cot as possible. She wrapped herself and her son in the thin wool, creating a small island of fragile safety. When Silas came back inside, he saw their nest on the floor and froze. A flicker of something, pain, memory, shame, crossed his face before the mask of stoicism fell back into place. He said nothing. He took a tin cup, filled it from the water bucket, and drank. He took a piece of dry jerky from a sack and ate it standing by the wooden door. Then he took his own blanket and went outside, closing the door softly behind him. Alara listened to his footsteps fade toward the lean-to. He was sleeping with the horse. The realization did not bring relief, only a deeper confusion. In the days that followed, a routine formed, as rigid and unspoken as a vow. He would rise before the dusty sun, chop wood, and tend to his traps. She would rise with the light, sweep the floor, fetch water, and prepare a simple meal from the supplies he had bought. They moved around each other like ghosts, never touching, their words limited to the barest necessities. More wood, the water's low, she found a rhythm in the work. The steady motion of grinding corn or mending one of Silas's worn shirts kept her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into the dark. She watched him. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and rough, were gentle with the horse. She saw the weariness in his shoulders at the end of each day. But most of all, she saw the emptiness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, a desolation that mirrored her own. She remained alert, a survivor tuned to the subtle frequencies of threat. His silence was a wall she could not penetrate. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. He began to help her in ways he hoped she wouldn't notice. One morning, a thicker, warmer blanket appeared on the pile she used for their bed on the floor. It was his own, the one he had been taking out to the lean-to. He had replaced it with a thinner horse blanket for himself. She noticed immediately. She ran her hand over the heavy, honest wool and felt a strange, unwelcome warmth spread through her chest. Felt like a trap. She said nothing. A few days later, while she was outside hanging laundry on a line strung between two spindly trees, he left a small, crudely carved wooden bird on the floor near where Leo was playing. The boy, who had been as silent as his mother, picked it up with a hesitant wonder. He turned the smooth, simple shape over in his small hands, a flicker of light in his solemn eyes. When Alara came back inside, she saw the toy and her heart constricted. She looked at Silas, who was mending a harness by the fire, his head bent, feigning absorption in his task. He was trying to get to her through her son. The thought was both terrifying and tender. The gestures continued, small and unobtrusive. An extra portion of stew left in the pot. A pair of his old, worn-down wool socks left near her shoes. Far too large but a barrier against the frosty air that seeped through the floorboards. Each act was a quiet question, and her silence was the only answer she could give. One evening, she watched him from the cabin window as he stood on the rise behind the house. The pale winter sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow-dusted ground. He was standing before the two mounds of rock, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He stayed there for a long time, a solitary figure communing with the dead. She realized then that the emptiness in his eyes was not just emptiness. It was grief. His silence was not a threat. It was a shroud. The cabin was not just a house. It was a tomb he shared with his ghosts. That night, she took the thick blanket he had given her and quietly laid it over him as he slept on the hard-packed earth of the lean-to. He did not stir, but in the morning, the blanket was neatly folded and placed back on her bed. No words were exchanged, but something had shifted. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of things unsaid, of shared sorrows and small, secret kindnesses. It was the beginning of a fragile truce. She was still afraid. But now, a tiny, growing seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. The sky had been a bruised slate gray for days, and the wind had a new, sharper edge. Silas knew what it meant. A blizzard was coming. He spent 2 days securing the homestead, banking snow against the cabin walls for insulation, bringing in a massive pile of firewood that reached the ceiling, and ensuring the horse was safe and fed in the lean-to. Alara worked alongside him, her movements quick and efficient, her face grim. She knew the signs, too. They were preparing for a siege. When the storm hit, it came with a terrifying fury. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a roaring, blinding whiteness. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow piled in deep drifts against the wooden door. For 3 days, they were prisoners in the small, smoky room, the fire in the hearth their only source of light and warmth. The enforced proximity was a heavy, suffocating thing. The silence, once a buffer, was now stretched thin. On the second night, Leo began to cough. It was a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the small space. By morning, he was burning with fever, his small body trembling under the blankets. Alara's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Fear, raw and maternal, took its place. She held him, rocking him, bathing his forehead with a damp cloth, but the fever wouldn't break. He grew limp and unresponsive, his breathing shallow. Silas watched, his own gut twisting with a helpless, familiar dread. He saw his own son, fading in his arms. He saw his wife's desperate, pleading eyes. He had been powerless then, and he felt powerless now. But this was different. He was not alone in his grief. He saw the terror in Alara's face, and it broke through his numbness. He crouched beside her. "Snow," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to bring the fever down together." They worked. He went out into the storm, shielded by the wall of the cabin, and filled a bucket with clean, fresh snow. She took off Leo's shirt and, her hands trembling, began rubbing the snow over his hot skin. The boy cried out, a weak, pitiful sound. Alara flinched, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop. Silas kept her steady, his hand on her shoulder, a solid, reliable pressure. Keep going, he breathed softly. You're doing it. They worked through the night, a desperate, silent team. He kept the fire fed. She tended to the child. They shared a tin cup of hot broth, their hands brushing in the firelight. For the first time, she did not pull away. Towards dawn, the fever broke. Leo's breathing deepened, and he fell into a true, healing sleep. Exhausted, Alara sagged against the wall, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful it left her weak. Silas placed a blanket around her weary shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes raw with gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words she had offered him that were not born of necessity. He just nodded, his own throat tight. He looked at the sleeping child, at this woman whose quiet strength mirrored the wife he had lost. The storm still raged outside, but inside the small cabin, something had broken open. The ice around his heart had begun to crack. The blizzard passed, leaving the world scoured clean and buried in a deep, silent white. Their supplies were dangerously low, depleted by the long storm. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. The journey back to the settlement was tense. The shared intimacy of the crisis had faded, replaced by a shy, uncertain awkwardness. The silence had returned, but its quality had changed. It was no longer a wall, but a space waiting to be filled. Redemption was struggling to dig itself out. The mood was fouler than usual, the hardship of the storm fraying already thin tempers. As they were loading flour and salt into the wagon, a familiar, dreaded voice cut through the air. "Well, look what the storm blew in." It was Jedediah Kane. He stood there, flanked by two of his men, a cruel smirk on his face. His eyes raked over Alara, possessive and mocking. "Enjoying your new master, girl? Or has this one tired of you already?" Alara froze, her blood turning to ice. She lowered her gaze, clutching the sack of flour to her chest like a shield. Leo, sensing his mother's fear, hid behind her skirts, his small hand clinging tightly to her dress. The townsfolk who were out and about stopped to watch, their faces eager for a spectacle. "I heard you took a liking to her," Kane continued, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "But a purchase is a purchase. Maybe I'll buy her back. For half of what you paid." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She was nothing, a piece of property to be traded and insulted. The public humiliation was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt every eye on her, stripping away the small measure of dignity she had managed to reclaim in the quiet of the homestead. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the dirty snow. She braced herself for what was to come, for Silas to be shamed by his impulsive purchase, to perhaps agree to the deal and rid himself of his burden. But Silas did not move. He stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. He didn't walk toward Kane. He walked to Alara and stood slightly in front of her, a silent, unmovable shield. The crowd fell silent, waiting. Kane's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Silas looked directly at him, and for the first time, the emptiness in his gaze was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire. He said, "She's with me." His voice was low, but it carried across the street with absolute authority. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the watching crowd, meeting every eye. Then he looked back at Kane. "Not bought. Chosen." The words landed with the force of a hammer blow. Chosen. The word hung in the frosty air, transforming the sordid transaction into a declaration of honor. It was a refutation of everything Kane and his world stood for. Kane stared, momentarily speechless. He saw the look in Silas's eyes and knew he had pushed too far. With a sneer, he spat on the ground. "Have it your way," he growled, turning away. "She ain't worth the trouble." As Kane and his men stalked off, Alara finally looked up at Silas. Her vision was blurred by tears, The first she had allowed herself to shed not from fear, but from a profound, unsteady relief. He stayed, a solid presence at her side, until she was ready to go. The ride home was quieter than ever before, but it was a deep, resonant silence, echoing with the power of his words. Chosen. The word played over and over in Alara's mind. It was a gift more precious than any coin, a shield against all the degradation she had endured. It was the restoration of her humanity. That evening, after Leo was asleep, they sat on the small porch of the cabin. A Chinook wind, warm and gentle, whispered through the dry grass, a promise of the coming spring. The vast expanse of stars glittered in the clear, cold sky. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The shared space between them was no